Hey, does anyone know what was going on with Zootopia? Like, maybe dealing in a biological binary of animal that gets hunted and animal that hunts animals for a story about racism is a bad idea. And the story can't even decide which group is the oppressor. The prey have references to racial discrimination the whole movie, but it's prejudice against predators that's the real conflict of the story. Why? Well, to find an answer, let's look at another Disney project that had a similar idea: Star versus the Forces of Evil, with their literal man eating monsters as minorities. If you want to go online, there's Rwby, where animal people represent black people. And then there's the ham fisted fight for freedom in Detroit Become Human. Now, what do they all have in common, folks? These stories all use imaginary things to talk about racism, aka fantastical racism, but they do it in a similar way. There are humans, and then there are poor non humans. By having humans be the oppressor and the non humans be the oppressed, it makes oppressors the characters easiest to relate to, especially when they're often the main cast. And a lot have story arcs spent vilifying the minorities, especially ones that are fighting against racism. Sometimes antagonists are too anti racist that they become racist towards the majority. Reverse racism isn't real, guys, but it sure is convenient that the revolutions for equality were led by bad guys, so that once they're killed, the white saviors who know better can handle it. I said protagonists, right? Spoilers for Legend of Korra Season 1, Rwby Volume 6, and Star vs. Season 4. Amon used violence to get equality for non-benders, and after his death, non-bender oppression was never addressed again by Korra, the ultimate bender. Adam used violence to get equality for Faunus, and after his death, Faunus oppression happens, but isn't confronted systemically by the majority of not Faunus main characters. Toffee used violence to get equality for monsters, and after his death, the royal family who oppressed them solved everything with genocide. So there are problems that unfortunately don't end there. No, we need to expand our scope by going from fantastical racism to fantasy races as a whole. Because fantasy races are a fantasy about racism, as they treat race as an unarguable otherness. Race can't merely be a social construct to justify white superiority, because look at these lesser beings. Don't they remind you of anyone? And that is a foot in the door for biological essentialism. You know those stories where if a fantasy race person and a human have a kid, the kid will always be the fantasy one? It's both a misunderstanding of how dominant alleles work and validation of interracial marriages will lead to the great replacement. People believe that interbreeding permanently tainted the bloodlines given the one drop rule. So, how is this any different? Or how, if an entire species is made to be inherently violent and less intelligent than a human, then aren't they more or less wild animals with tools? Why invoke the idea of them being subhuman in ways that real people are currently dehumanized with? Is it to explain the mistreatment they face? And why does there have to be a reason for the fictional racism? Is it to alleviate the blame from characters in the oppressive class who are either passively or actively racist? Sure, Judy almost pepper sprayed her friend, but how could you blame her when he's a predator? She's a good person, please buy merch of her. But racism doesn't have a reason to exist. Nothing in biology supports racism. It's just something that those in power decided to justify their power. But do these writers think there's factual support for racism? I think the main reason for all these problems is that white creators and executive producers who get the spotlight and control of creative industries put their own unchecked racism into these stories and try to excuse it. That's why the oppressors are made to be the easiest to relate to. The oppressors are the ones deciding who's a full person. See how these stories exaggerate bigotry to comical levels. Every member of the oppressive group is either a genocidal villain that's too monstrous to be human, or a virtuous bleeding heart that gets the struggle. The very real shades of gray people occupy are swept under the rug. If you're not as cartoonishly callous as the fictional racist, then you must be like the ally, who's not racist at all. You're not racist because you're too nice to be evil. Hatred is treated like a surface-level detail instead of a deep-rooted injustice. But bigotry is more than the cruelty of a few individuals. It's minority neighborhoods that exist due to redlining being poisoned, and then doctors refusing to take those patients seriously when they seek treatment. The institution of the police, from its origins as slave catchers to its brutality towards the impoverished, is racist. Capitalism requiring certain groups of people to be paid less than the worth of their labor so that their bosses can profit is racist. These root issues can never be discussed in mainstream media because those in power benefit from them. Plus, by ignoring those issues, white writers can downplay the horrors of racism when it gets too dark. The human trafficking of millions of African people for labor and rape was pretty mortifying, so let's only talk about mean individuals to avoid being a downer. All this to sell more episodes, books, movies, whatever. Anything can be used to make money. Capitalism will sell progressivism in one hand while selling fascism in the other. Wow, it's like hacks only care about real-world problems when they can be a neat gimmick to add some spice to entertain presumably white audiences without ever challenging the society we live in. The Hunger Games are cool. The countless deaths of the competitive work environment we are forced to participate in to survive are ignored. These writers want the drama of racism, but have no actual experience of racial oppression. See how often these stories have a few characters of color who aren't affected by racism. Like, racism doesn't exist for them, only for the fictional group. I suppose it's because when the characters actually do comment on racism, we get that scene in Bright. They don't know how to write people of color in their racism stories, hence why they make up fake racism. Why do white production teams do this? No one is forcing them to. They just take on the burden of educating the ignorant masses of how bad racism is because only they know best. If you think it's an important issue, why not give the people most affected by racism a platform to discuss it? Ray Bearer is a fantasy story written by a black woman that explores systemic injustice without having monsters be the victims of that injustice. So there are people who know what they're doing. They just get less attention than those only using dark subjects for clout. Because yes, fantasy can be used to explore bigotry. It can take an idea and explore its extreme. Like you have more in common with a citizen from another country than a member of your own government. But what about a citizen from another planet? Understanding can only be achieved by those who already understand or are willing to understand. Too many of those with influence are neither of these things. But we can show support to those deserving so that they can have influence, instead of indulging in misleading, racist fantasies. If you enjoyed this, so I just remembered Overwatch also has robot racism that was justified because bots literally kill humans. Alright, no one gets to write fantastical racism anymore, it's irredeemable. I'm taking a break from essays to become Twitch famous and draw a webcomic and make shorts because all this scripting hurts my brain. Subscribe for who knows what. Bye.